She held the last piece of her career in a manila envelope, and the woman behind the desk was about to tear it in half without reading a single word inside it.
You are lying. You're not a doctor. You're not anything.
You have no idea what you just destroyed.
Dr. Renata Coleman did not raise her voice. She did not lift her chin. She simply watched the woman's manicured fingers find the seam of the envelope's flap and pull, slow and deliberate, the way people move when they already believe they are right. Somewhere behind her, a toddler laughed at nothing. A vending machine hummed. And in 4 minutes, the same hallway would fall so silent you could hear the paper settle on the floor. 6 minutes after that, the hospital's most powerful board member would drop to his knees in front of her and beg. Have you ever watched someone decide who you are before you have said a single word, and then watch that decision cost them everything? This is that story, and I promise you it does not end where you think.
I pray today favors me. Less drama.
Renata Coleman was 46 years old, and she had spent 11 of those years wearing a different kind of coat than the one hanging on the credentialing office hook that morning. Before Ashwood Regional Medical Center, before the quiet Tuesday she is standing in now, she had spent 3 deployments patching soldiers back together in tents that shook when artillery landed close enough to matter. She had operated by generator light. She had once closed a chest cavity using instruments boiled in a pot over an open flame because the sterilizer had been destroyed the night before. Her hands did not shake in rooms where other surgeons' hands shook. Her father, a Navy corpsman himself, used to tell her that the work does not care what people assume about you, only what you do with your hands when it matters. She had built her whole life around that sentence, quietly, without needing anyone in the room to notice. She had driven to Ashwood that morning in a car with 190,000 miles on it, wearing a plain gray blazer instead of a white coat, because credentialing appointments did not require scrubs, only patience and paperwork. Her badge from her last post had expired. Her new one was not printed yet. All she carried physically was a folder of transferred licenses, deployment records, and a letter of recommendation from a rear admiral who did not write letters for people he did not respect. She had learned, over 2 decades in medicine, that the folder mattered more than the coat, and that the coat mattered more than either to people who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. She walked into the lobby at Ashwood at 9:10, and she felt the room do what rooms like this one always did. It measured her, and it started guessing wrong immediately. Behind the credentialing desk sat Deborah Voss, sharp-suited, mid-50s, a woman who had run that office for 19 years the way some people run a private kingdom. Voss did not like surprises, and she especially did not like people who did not look the way she expected the word doctor to look. She glanced up when Renata approached, took in the plain blazer, the worn leather folder, the calm unhurried posture of someone who had waited in worse lines for worse reasons, and she made a decision in under 4 seconds that she would spend the rest of the year regretting. "Can I help you?" she said in a tone that made clear she doubted it. Renata set the folder on the counter with both hands, the way she had learned to present anything that mattered, gently, so it could not be mistaken for anything but what it was.
I have a 9 o'clock
"Good morning,"
appointment.
she said. "I have a 9 o'clock credentialing appointment. Dr. Renata Coleman, incoming trauma faculty." The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds, but silence like that has weight, and everyone standing near enough to hear it felt it settle over the front desk like a held breath. Voss did not open the folder. She looked instead at the woman standing in front of her, at the plain shoes, the tired car keys still in her hand, the absence of the white coat that Voss had decided, somewhere in her own head years ago, was the only proof that counted. A young clerk 2 seats down, Priya Malhotra, glanced up from her monitor, sensed something shifting in the air, and felt her stomach tighten the way people do right before they watch something they will remember for the rest of their lives. If you were standing in that lobby right now, watching a woman's whole career sit unopened on a counter in front of someone who had already made up her mind, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching this from, because in about 90 seconds, this room is going to change forever. "Trauma faculty," Voss repeated, letting the words sit in her mouth like something she did not care to swallow. She did not open the folder. Instead, she looked past Renata toward the parking lot, as though she were checking for a white coat that might be walking in a few steps behind, a real doctor who had simply sent an assistant ahead to handle the paperwork. "I think there's been some confusion," Voss said, and she said it kindly, the practiced kindness of someone about to be cruel, and calling it help. "This desk is for physician credentialing. If you're here about volunteer intake or patient transport, that's the office around the corner." Renata did not blink. She had heard some version of this sentence in a dozen buildings over 2 decades, and she had learned that answering the insult directly only fed it. "I am aware of what this desk is for," she said evenly. "I am a physician. My credentialing packet is in that folder. May I ask you to open it?" Voss opened the folder then, but she did not read it the way credentialing officers are trained to read documents. She flipped through it the way someone flips through a stranger's mail, quickly, looking for something to disqualify rather than something to confirm. She landed on the deployment records first, pages stamped with unfamiliar seals from an overseas combat hospital, and her mouth thinned into a line. "These aren't standard board certifications," she said. "I don't recognize half of these letterheads. Where exactly did you say you trained?" Renata felt the shape of the next hour arrive before it happened, the way a nurse feels a code coming before the monitor confirms it. "3 of my residencies were completed stateside," she said. "The letterheads you don't recognize are from naval trauma units. I served 11 years as a combat surgeon before transitioning to civilian trauma practice. Everything in that folder is verifiable with one phone call." "A phone call," Voss said, and she laughed, short and dry, the kind of laugh that invites an audience even when none has been asked for yet. 2 nurses passing behind the desk slowed their steps without meaning to, the universal instinct of people who sense a scene assembling itself, and do not want to miss it. Priya, at the next terminal, opened her mouth once and then closed it again, the way people do when their conscience arrives a half-second before their courage does. "Ma'am," Voss went on, loud enough now for the row of waiting patients to hear clearly. "I have worked credentialing for 19 years, and I have seen every kind of forged packet you can imagine. Fake seals. Copied letterheads. People who show up dressed like they walked out of a laundromat claiming Ivy League residencies." She said it as though she were performing a public service, protecting the hospital from a threat only she could see. Renata's jaw tightened, once, and then loosened, the exact motion of a woman who had trained her whole body not to give anger the satisfaction of showing itself. An older man in the waiting chairs, there for his own appointment, chuckled under his breath to the woman beside him. "They get bolder every year," he murmured, not quite quiet enough, and the woman beside him smiled instead of hushing him. It was a small thing, one sentence from a stranger who had no stake in the outcome, but it did what small things like that always do in rooms like this one. It gave the room permission to stop being neutral and start being an audience. Somewhere near the elevator bank, a phone rose, angled just enough to catch the desk without looking obvious about it. Renata saw all of it, the phone, the smiles, the 2 nurses who had stopped walking entirely now, and she said nothing about any of it. She had learned that reacting to an audience only grows the audience. "Call the number on the top page," she said instead, steady as a closed door. "Ask for Commander Alvarez by name. He will confirm every word in that folder in under 2 minutes." Voss did not call the number. Instead, she closed the folder with a snap that carried further than she probably intended, and she looked at Renata with the particular contempt of someone who has decided that being wrong out loud is less humiliating than admitting she might be wrong at all. "I don't take instructions from people I'm actively investigating for fraud," she said, and for the first time her voice climbed enough that people 3 counters down turned fully around in their chairs. Renata felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in rooms like this, not anger, but a kind of tired, ancient recognition, the sense of watching a scene she had lived a version of before, in a dealership 30 years ago, in a hotel lobby a decade before that, in 100 small rooms where a folder full of proof had never once been enough on its own. She did not know yet that in 6 minutes, The very same folder would be the reason a 14-year-old boy was still breathing. "I'm going to need you to step away from this desk," Voss said, and she said it the way people say things they have decided will end an argument simply because they said it firmly. Renata did not step away. She kept her hands flat on the counter, visible, the exact posture her father had taught her decades before she ever wore a uniform. "I would like my folder back," she said quietly. "And I would like you to make the phone call." Voss's fingers found the edge of the manila envelope again, and this time she did not open it to search for flaws. She simply lifted it, held it at eye level for the row of watching strangers, and said, loud enough to reach the far wall, "I am not going to let a fabricated credentials packet walk onto this hospital floor." Then, before Priya could rise from her chair, before the older nurse near the elevators could finish the sentence forming in her mouth, Voss tore the folder in half. The sound was small, a soft tearing of paper and cardstock, but it landed in that lobby like a gunshot. Deployment records, half of a rear admiral's signature, the corner of a residency certificate from a program that had trained some of the finest trauma surgeons on the East Coast, all of it fluttered apart in Deborah Voss's hands and drifted onto the polished floor between them. Renata did not flinch. She looked down at the scattered pages the way a person looks at wreckage they have already grieved once before, and then she lifted her eyes back to Voss, calm as still water. "You have no idea what you just destroyed," she said, and she said it so quietly that 3 people leaned forward just to hear it, which was somehow worse for Voss than if she had shouted. A phone near the ropes rose higher. The red recording dot multiplied twice more across the lobby in the space of a single breath. "Is that a threat?" Voss said, pitching her voice for the growing audience rather than for Renata alone, and before Renata could answer, Voss had already pulled her own cell phone from her blazer pocket with a flourish built for witnesses. "Security to the front desk," she said into it, though anyone standing close enough could see there was no security line dialed at all, only her own voice performing urgency into an empty call. "I have someone here presenting fraudulent medical credentials and refusing to leave the premises." None of it was true, and everyone within 20 feet who had actually watched the last 4 minutes knew it was not true, and not one of them said a word. A guard near the pharmacy door, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Webb, pushed off the wall he had been leaning against and started toward them, uncertain, the particular uncertainty of a man paid to enforce a story he was not sure was real. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," Marcus said, closing a careful hand around Renata's upper arm, not rough, but final. Renata did not resist. She had made a decision decades ago, long before any of these people were born, that she would not give a room the satisfaction of watching her lose her composure, no matter what the room took from her first. She bent instead, slow and deliberate, and picked up one torn half of the rear admiral's letter from the floor, folding it carefully into her palm the way a person folds something they intend to need again. "Keep that," she told Marcus quietly, nodding at the scattered pages Voss had not bothered to gather. "Someone is going to want to see exactly what happened here." Priya, still frozen at her terminal, finally found the nerve to stand, and in that exact instant, a code alarm tore through the hallway loud enough to stop every conversation in the building at once. The overhead speakers crackled with the flat, practiced urgency of a voice trained to sound calm while announcing catastrophe. "Trauma 1, incoming, multi-vehicle, pediatric, ETA 2 minutes, all available surgical staff to Bay 3. Marcus's grip loosened half an inch without him quite meaning it to. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse broke into a run, and a second voice, sharper, cut through the intercom right behind the first. "We need Coleman." "Where is Dr. Coleman?" "The Admiral said she just landed, she's supposed to be in the building." Voss's face, still bright with the certainty of a woman who has never once been made to answer for anything, went perfectly, completely still. If you have ever watched someone's whole understanding of a moment collapse in under 3 seconds, tell me below where you're watching this from tonight, because what happens in the next chapter is the reason this story exists at all. Marcus's hand was still closed around Renata's arm when the second announcement landed, and for a moment nobody in that lobby moved at all, as if the building itself had taken a breath and was waiting to see what would happen next. A young resident came sprinting from the direction of the elevator bank, badge flapping against his chest, scanning faces along the row of chairs with the particular desperation of someone who has been sent to find one specific person in a building full of strangers. His eyes landed on Renata, still standing in a guard's grip, torn paper scattered at her feet, and something like relief and horror crossed his face at exactly the same time. "Dr. Coleman," he said, breathless. "Thank God, we've been trying to reach you since your flight landed. We need you in Bay 3 right now. There's no one else on staff who has done a field thoracotomy in the last 5 years, and the boy is not going to make it to the OR." The boy, it would turn out within the hour, was 14 years old, and he was the only son of Richard Ashcombe Whitfield, chairman of the hospital's board of directors, the same board that had approved Renata's recruitment 3 weeks earlier on the strength of a recommendation letter that Deborah Voss had just torn into pieces on the lobby floor. A motorcycle had clipped his father's car on the interstate an hour outside the city, and the boy, riding as a passenger, had taken the worst of it: a crushed chest cavity, a collapsed lung, and bleeding. The trauma team could not locate fast enough with the equipment on hand. The kind of injury, the resident explained in a rush of words as they moved, that required someone who had done this exact procedure not in a textbook but in a tent with artillery in the distance, someone whose hands did not hesitate when the monitor screamed and the room ran out of easy answers. Marcus let go of Renata's arm without being asked, and for a half-second his face did something complicated, somewhere between shame and relief, as if his own hands had just remembered what they should have known all along. Renata did not look back at Voss. She did not need to. She simply straightened her blazer, the same plain gray blazer Voss had measured and dismissed less than 10 minutes earlier, and she said 4 words to the resident that would be repeated in that hospital for years afterward. "Show me the boy." She moved through the hallway the way she had moved through combat corridors a decade earlier, unhurried on the outside and entirely focused underneath, past the ropes, past the frozen row of chairs, past Priya, who had finally found her feet and was already running 2 steps behind her with a spare set of scrubs pulled from a supply closet. In Bay 3, the boy's chest monitor was screaming in a rhythm no trauma team wants to hear, a young attending calling numbers that were sliding the wrong direction, a nurse's hands trembling as she prepared instruments for a procedure she had only ever performed twice. Renata scrubbed in without a word of introduction, because introductions were a luxury for rooms with time to spare, and this was not one of them. She opened the boy's chest with the same steady, unshaking hands that had closed wounds using instruments boiled over open flame, and the room around her fell into the particular silence that surrounds people who suddenly understand they are watching something they will never forget. Somewhere down the hall, word had already begun to travel, the way it always does in hospitals, faster than any announcement, faster than any policy could contain it. The woman from the front desk. The one they tore the folder for. She's the only one who can save him. 17 minutes later, the monitor's scream settled into something survivable, and Renata Coleman stepped back from the table with blood on her gloves and the particular exhaustion of a surgeon who has just pulled someone back from the very edge of the worst sentence a parent can hear. The attending who had been calling numbers a moment before stood frozen, staring at her hands, at the calm, practiced motion of someone closing a chest cavity like she had done it 1,000 times in rooms with far less light than this one. Outside the bay doors, word had reached the boy's father, and Richard Ashcombe Whitfield was already moving down the hallway at a run that no amount of money or authority had ever taught him how to slow. He did not know yet that the woman who had just saved his son's life was the same woman his own credentialing office had just publicly humiliated and accused of fraud less than 20 minutes earlier. He was about to find out in the worst possible way, and if you are still watching this closely, drop a comment right now telling me what you think Deborah Voss is feeling in this exact moment, because it is about to get much, much worse for her. Richard Ashcombe Whitfield burst through the bay doors just as the surgical team was wheeling his son toward recovery, and for a moment he could not speak at all, could only stand there with his hand pressed against his mouth, staring at the boy's chest rising and falling on its own, unassisted, alive. When he finally found words, they came out cracked and small, nothing like the voice that had run board meetings and closed hospital acquisitions for 2 decades. "Who he managed. Who did this? Who saved him? The attending beside him, still shaking slightly from the last half hour, pointed toward the scrub sink where Renata stood washing blood from her hands with the same unhurried calm she had carried into the lobby that morning. Dr. Coleman, the attending said quietly. She just flew in this morning for her first day. She hadn't even finished credentialing yet. Whitfield crossed the hallway and stopped in front of her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, taking in details he had never once thought to notice before in the dozens of surgeons he had shaken hands with over the years, the plain blazer hanging on a hook nearby, the tired eyes of someone who had flown across an ocean and walked straight into a fight before she had even unpacked. "You saved my son," he said, and his voice broke fully on the last word. "Yes," Renata said simply, drying her hands. "He has a long recovery ahead of him, but he is going to live." Whitfield's next question came slower, the question of a man who was beginning, in real time, to understand a story he had not yet been told. "Someone said there was an incident at the front desk this morning. Someone said your credentials were torn up." Renata did not answer right away. She had learned long ago that some silences say more than any accusation could. It was Priya who finally spoke, stepping forward from where she had been standing quietly by the wall, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and something closer to shame. "It's true, Mr. Whitfield," she said, and her voice, though small, carried the particular weight of someone who has decided that staying silent one more time was no longer a price she was willing to pay. "Ms. Voss refused to verify her credentials. She said the deployment records were fabricated. She tore the folder in half in front of the entire lobby and called security, and she told the dispatcher Dr. Coleman was being aggressive when she never raised her voice a single time." Whitfield's face, still pale from the last hour, hardened into something else entirely, the particular fury of a man who had just watched the most important surgeon in his son's life get treated like a criminal by his own staff 20 minutes before she saved that life. He turned and walked the length of that hallway toward the front lobby with a stride that made two administrators flatten themselves against the wall to let him pass, and when he reached the credentialing desk, Deborah Voss was still standing exactly where she had been, still holding her cell phone, still waiting for a security team that had never actually been dispatched at all. "Ms. Voss," Whitfield said, and his voice was quiet in the exact way that dangerous things are quiet. "Do you know whose credentials you tore up this morning?" Voss opened her mouth to answer, already reaching for the same certainty that had carried her through the last hour, and then she saw his face, and whatever she had been about to say died somewhere in her throat. "That woman just spent the last 40 minutes with her hands inside my son's chest," Whitfield said. "She is the reason he is alive right now. And you called the police on her for showing you the proof." Voss's hand, still holding her phone, began to shake, and for the first time that morning she had absolutely nothing to say. Whitfield did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the truth in the room was doing all the work anger usually has to do on its own. He turned instead to Renata, who had followed him quietly down the hallway, still in scrubs, still carrying the folded half of a torn letter in her pocket, and he did something that stopped the entire lobby cold. He bowed his head, just slightly, the way people do only in front of someone they have suddenly understood they owe everything to, and he said the words so many people in that lobby had refused her less than an hour earlier. "Sir," he said, though she was not a man, the old habit of deference slipping out before he could catch it, and then he corrected himself, quieter, more careful. Dr. Coleman." "Thank you. I don't have the words for what you just did for my family. Comment below if you saw that coming, because Chapter 6 is where this hospital changes for good." Deborah Voss did not lose her job that afternoon, though by the end of the week she would, quietly and without the audience she had always seemed to crave. What changed first, within hours, was smaller and larger at the same time. Whitfield called an emergency session with the hospital's credentialing board that same evening, and by the following morning, every physician arriving at Ashwood Regional, regardless of how they were dressed or what car they had parked outside, would be greeted at a front desk with a new sign bolted to the counter, listing in plain language exactly what a credentialing officer was and was not permitted to say to an incoming physician. And exactly who to call if those rules were ever ignored. Rules do not fix a person's assumptions on their own, Renata would say later, but good rules make cruelty expensive, and sometimes that is enough to change what a room is willing to tolerate the next time someone walks through its doors. Priya Malhotra did not lose her job either, though for entirely different reasons. She was the only person in that lobby who had tried, even in a small trembling voice, to slow the moment down before it became irreversible, and Whitfield made certain the right people knew it. Within 3 months, she had been moved out of the credentialing office entirely and into a new role the hospital created specifically because of what had happened that Tuesday morning, a patient and staff advocacy liaison, someone whose entire job was to be the voice in the room that speaks up before the folder gets torn in half. She would tell new hires, in the years that followed, that courage is rarely convenient, and the moment either finds you ready or it does not, and the room remembers which one happened. Marcus Webb, the guard who had closed his hand around Renata's arm that morning, requested a transfer to the trauma wing's security detail 2 weeks later, and told his supervisor, when asked why, that he wanted to be closer to the kind of moment where his hands might actually matter. Renata Coleman finished her credentialing, formally, 3 days later, in a room with no torn envelopes and no waiting audience, and she began her first full week as Ashwood's newest trauma faculty exactly the way she had planned to before any of this happened, quietly, without needing anyone in the building to make a fuss about it. She asked for one thing in return for accepting the board's public apology, and it was not money and it was not a title. She asked that the hospital fund a mentorship pipeline for young women, particularly young black women, who were considering careers in trauma surgery but had never once seen someone who looked like them standing at the head of an operating table. She named it after the corpsman who had raised her, the father who had told her the work does not care what people assume about you, only what you do with your hands when it finally matters, and she asked that the first class be recruited directly from the same neighborhoods that had once taught her to keep her hands where everyone could see them. 3 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Renata Coleman walked back through the same lobby doors, wearing the same plain blazer, carrying a folder that no one now dared to question. A greeter met her 3 steps inside, warm and immediate, and said, "Good morning, Dr. Coleman, welcome back," exactly the way it should have been said the first time. Priya crossed the lobby to walk her to the elevator herself, not out of obligation now, but because she wanted to, and somewhere behind the new credentialing desk, a different clerk verified a new physician's paperwork within 90 seconds, without a single question about what a doctor was supposed to look like. Richard Whitfield's son, recovering well, would visit the hospital that same week for a follow-up appointment, and he would ask, shyly, if the doctor who saved him might someday teach him how to do what she did, and she told him that the work was available to anyone willing to let it speak for them, quietly, patiently, for as long as it took. I did not invent the feeling of walking into a room and watching someone decide who you are before you have said a single word. A lot of you have lived some version of this, in offices, in hospitals, in places that were supposed to see your credentials before they saw anything else, and I know it does not always end the way this story did. Here is what stays with me. She never raised her voice. She never once let them see the moment cost her anything. She simply kept her hands visible, and let the work speak, exactly the way she had been raised to. So let me ask you honestly, if you had been standing in that lobby watching a torn folder settle onto the floor, would you have looked away like everyone else, or would you have been the one who finally asked the question? Tell me below, and tell me where in the world you are watching this from tonight, because stories like this one only travel as far as the people willing to say something the next time they are the only one in the room who sees.